You clicked because I said a Nazi prisoner of war married a black American nurse when interracial marriage could send you to prison for years. That's exactly what happened in 1947, and I'm about to show you how they pulled it off. Plus, the shocking reason the U.S. Army put them together in the first place. Here's where this story starts. 1944. An African-American nurse walks into a Woolworth's lunch counter in Phoenix, Arizona. She's wearing her full United States Army Nurse Corps uniform. The waiter looks at her uniform, looks at her brown skin, and says no, she can't be served here. Meanwhile, down the road at Camp Florence Prisoner of War Camp, German soldiers, actual Nazi prisoners of war, are eating in restaurants that this American nurse in uniform cannot enter. And here's where it gets absolutely wild. One of those German POWs looked at this nurse and said, "You should know my name. I'm the man who's going to marry you." That nurse was Eleanor Powell. That prisoner was Frederick Albert. And their love story, which began 20 years before the Supreme Court would legalize interracial marriage nationwide, exposes one of the most disturbing paradoxes in American history. The United States was fighting fascism abroad, while German prisoners of war enjoyed more rights than black American soldiers on American soil. In the next 30 minutes, I'm taking you inside this verified World War II story that remained hidden for 70 years. You'll discover how the Army's racist assumption backfired spectacularly. You'll learn about the deliberate strategy Eleanor and Frederick used to beat deportation, a strategy so risky it could have destroyed both their lives. You'll see the exact penalties for interracial marriage in 1947. We're talking years in prison, not just fines. And you'll find out where they finally discovered a place that would accept them. This isn't a feel-good Hollywood romance. This is documented history that reveals uncomfortable truths about America during what we call the Good War. If you want to understand how deep systemic racism ran in 1940s, America, even while fighting Hitler, stay with me. And if this story shifts how you see World War II, tap that like button. It helps others discover this. Let's go back to 1941. The United States Army Nurse Corps has a problem. Actually, they have 9,000 qualified black nurses who want to serve their country, but the Army has a quota, 56. That's it. 56 black nurses total allowed in the entire Army Nurse Corps. Meanwhile, they're accepting white nurses by the thousands. By the war's end, 59,000 white nurses would serve. Black nurses? 500. That's 0.8%. Here's what makes this even more insulting. When black nurses applied in early 1941, rejection letters stated explicitly, "Your application to the POW, Army Nurse Corps, cannot be given favorable consideration as there are no provisions in Army regulations for the appointment of colored nurses in the Corps." No provisions. They weren't even pretending. This was official policy. The requirements were designed to exclude. Black nurse applicants had to have graduated from hospitals with 50 or more beds. That eliminated most black nurses who graduated from small segregated schools. The system was rigged from the beginning. But here's the thing. America needed nurses. Desperately. The war was expanding. Casualties were mounting, and the Army was running out of white nurses willing to do every assignment. So they reluctantly increased the quota to 160 in 1943. Then they officially lifted the quota in July 1944. But lifting the quota didn't mean black nurses were treated equally. Far from it. Black nurses who made it into the Army Nurse Corps faced two types of assignments. Only two. First, segregated military bases like Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Livingston in Louisiana, Fort Huachuca in Arizona. There, they treated black soldiers in segregated hospital wards. They couldn't treat white soldiers. They were excluded from officer meetings, excluded from social functions. Second assignment type, prisoner of war camps. And this is where our story really begins. 30 nurses were sent to Liberia to the 25th Station Hospital in February 1943. Another unit was sent to England, not to care for wounded American soldiers, but to care for German prisoners of war. And then, in 1944, something happened at Camp Florence, Arizona, that would change military policy and lead directly to Eleanor and Frederick's meeting. Camp Florence was massive, built in 1942 and 1943 as the first permanent alien enemy camp constructed during World War II. It was located in Florence, Pinal County, Arizona, about 70 miles northwest of Tucson. Initial construction budget was $4.8 million. The camp was designed to hold 3,000 to 6,000 prisoners, but by December 1945, it held approximately 13,000 German and Austrian POWs captured primarily in North Africa and Italy. To understand Camp Florence, you need to understand the scale of the American POW system. 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in 700 camps throughout the United States during World War II. These camps existed in 46 of 48 states. This was a massive operation. German POWs were everywhere in America, from Arizona to New York, from Texas to Minnesota. Most Americans living during the war knew about these camps. They saw prisoners working in agricultural fields. They saw them in town with guards. This was not hidden. The facilities at Camp Florence were extensive. Military barracks, central mess hall, hospital with full, medical facilities, bakery operated by prisoners, swimming pool, athletic fields, theaters, and a chapel built by Italian prisoners. Think about that for a moment. Swimming pool, athletic fields, theaters. These prisoners had better recreational facilities than many American communities. The German POWs were treated well according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. They received the same food rations as American guards. They were paid 50 to 80 cents per hour for work, primarily cotton picking and agricultural labor. They had access to recreational activities. They received daily beer coupons and cigarette rations. One German prisoner stated, "I've never felt so grateful as I do now." Meanwhile, at Fort Huachuca, where Eleanor trained, black soldiers and nurses faced completely different conditions. Fort Huachuca was the largest military installation for black soldiers and nurses during the war. It was also deeply segregated. Black personnel lived in separate quarters, ate in separate dining facilities, and were trained separately from white personnel. When black soldiers and nurses left the base to go into nearby towns, they faced hostility and discrimination. This was their reward for volunteering to serve their country. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Camp Florence initially had white nurses on staff, and Army Command noticed something they didn't like. Too much fraternization between white nurses and German POWs. Romantic connections were developing. This violated military regulations. So the Army made a decision based on a deeply racist assumption. They decided to replace the white nurses with black nurses. 48 black nurses were brought in as replacements in 1944. The calculation was simple and disgusting. Army Command believed the risk of fraternization between black nurses and white German POWs was almost nil. They assumed that black women and white German men would have no attraction to each other. They assumed racial prejudice would act as a natural barrier. This wasn't an isolated policy. Prisoner of war camps became an ongoing assignment for the majority of African American nurses during the war. Think about how offensive this was. black nurses had volunteered to serve wounded American soldiers. Instead, they were assigned to care for Nazi prisoners, most of whom were in good health because they had to be healthy enough to survive the transatlantic journey. Black nurses weren't fully utilized. This was considered a second-rate assignment and a profound betrayal after decades of black nurses fighting for admission to the Army Nurse Corps. And here's what makes it worse. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a German POW declared he hated the N-word in front of a black nurse. The commanding officer provided no punishment. German prisoners of war could use racial slurs against American military personnel with zero consequences. At Camp Florence, black nurses were forced to eat in segregated dining halls, regularly excluded from officer meetings and social functions, and refused service at restaurants and businesses in nearby Phoenix and Florence. Which brings us back to that Woolworth's lunch counter. Eleanor Powell, in full United States Army Nurse Corps uniform, walked into a Woolworth's in Phoenix in 1944. The waiter looked at her uniform, looked at her brown skin, and refused to serve her. She returned to Camp Florence humiliated. Meanwhile, German POWs could visit restaurants that black American soldiers could not do to Jim Crow laws. This paradox became one of the most powerful symbols of American racial hypocrisy during the war. Black soldiers traveling from Camp Claiborne to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, stopped at a Texas train depot. Black soldiers were denied access to the whites-only dining hall. Through the window, they watched German prisoners of war and American guards sitting together, laughing and eating. This incident was documented in Yank, the Army Weekly, in April 1944, in a letter from Corporal Rupert Trimmingham. It inspired a short story in The New Yorker and became emblematic of the Double Victory campaign, fighting fascism abroad and racism at home. The evidence of this bitter irony is extensive. At Camp Gordon Johnston, Florida, black servicemen were assigned to dispose of the human waste of the whole camp, including that of POWs. In a Utah incident, German POWs refused to work for black soldier Private Joseph due to his race. White officers responded by saying, "Colored boys are not allowed to detail or work prisoners of war." At a Florida camp, black soldiers were constantly guarded by armed guards for minor offenses, while the Nazis arrogantly walked around the field free. German POWs received daily beer coupons and cigarette rations, wine for general officers, special meals for Thanksgiving and Christmas, payment equal to an American private's pay, 80 cents per day. One POW testified, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 185. 57 pounds gained while in captivity." Meanwhile, black American soldiers were losing weight on inadequate rations at segregated facilities. Many German POWs were shocked by the segregation and racism in America. These were men who'd grown up under Nazi ideology, and even they found American racism disturbing. They saw segregated bathrooms and restricted dining halls at train stations. They saw black train attendants bringing them food, calling them sir. They saw black Americans treated worse than enemy prisoners. Some POWs wrote letters home describing the bizarre racial system they encountered. Here they were, captured enemy soldiers, and they had more freedom of movement, better food, and more respect than black Americans in uniform. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. said this on March 7, 1945, "It is absolutely unbelievable that in times like these, when the world is going forward, that there are leaders in our American life who are going backward. It is further unbelievable that these leaders have become so blindly and unreasonably un-American that they have forced our wounded men to face the tragedy of death rather than allow trained nurses to aid, because these nurses' skins happen to be of a different color." The ultimate irony? The Nazis, like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, found U.S. white supremacy to be excellent propaganda. Nazi race policies were often inspired by American ones. And now, in 1944, the U.S. Army's racist assumption was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. 20-year-old Frederick Albert was a German POW working as a cook in the officers' mess hall at Camp Florence. Born August 20th, 1925, he'd been captured in Italy in 1944 while serving in the Wehrmacht. 23-year-old Eleanor Powell was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, one of the 48 black nurses brought in to replace white staff. Born August 20th, 1921 in Milton, Norfolk, Massachusetts, to William Powell and Gladys Farrow, she'd trained at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, the largest military installation for black soldiers and nurses. They shared the same birthday, August 20th. And when Frederick saw Eleanor walk into that mess hall, he didn't see a black woman he was supposed to be repelled by. He saw the woman he was going to marry. His first words to her are consistently reported across every source. "You should know my name. I'm the man who's going to marry you." That's not a subtle approach. That's not testing the waters. That's a man who knew exactly what he wanted and didn't care about the consequences. And the consequences? They were severe. Fraternization between POWs and American personnel was strictly forbidden under military regulations and Geneva Convention protocols. Both military personnel and civilians were prohibited from fraternizing with prisoners. Court-martial was possible for military personnel who fraternized, but here's what made their relationship even more dangerous. Both the United States and Germany had laws against interracial relationships during this period. For black women and white men specifically, the relationship was against the law in most American jurisdictions. Eleanor faced potential court-martial. Frederick faced repatriation without possibility of return. If discovered, both their lives would be destroyed. They took the risk anyway. They developed a secret relationship at Camp Florence. They had to be extraordinarily careful. No public displays, no witnesses, everything conducted in absolute secrecy, and somehow they pulled it off. For months, no one discovered them, but they both knew this couldn't last. The war was ending. Frederick would be deported back to Germany, and once he left American soil, he would likely never be allowed to return, especially not to marry a black American woman. So they made a calculated decision, a risky decision, a decision that required extraordinary courage. Before Frederick's deportation, they would deliberately conceive a child. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't carelessness. This was strategy. If Eleanor had Frederick's child, it would give Frederick grounds to obtain a visa to return to the United States. It was their only chance. In April 1946, Frederick was deported to Germany along with thousands of other German POWs. Eleanor returned to Massachusetts, pregnant and unmarried. Her father had died. Her mother disapproved. In December 1946, she gave birth to their son, Stephen. Eleanor was a black single mother with a white German POW's child in 1946 America. Think about that for a moment. Think about the judgment. Think about the isolation. Think about the danger. But their plan worked. Frederick obtained a visa to return to the United States in 1947. And on June 26, 1947, Eleanor Powell and Frederick Albert were married at City Hall in Manhattan, New York City. Why New York? Because New York was one of only 9 states or territories that never enacted anti-miscegenation laws. Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Alaska, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. These were the only places in America where their marriage was legal. Let me be specific about what they were avoiding. In 1947, 30 of 48 states prohibited interracial marriage, and the penalties were not symbolic. In Alabama, marriage or cohabitation between black and white people resulted in 2 to 7 years in the penitentiary. Ministers who performed these ceremonies faced $100 to $1,000 fines and up to 6 months in jail. The definition of black was anyone with 1 drop of Negro blood. In Florida, marriage with anyone with 1/8 African or Negro blood resulted in up to 10 years in prison. Offspring were declared illegitimate. In Virginia, the standard was no trace whatever of non-white blood. This was a felony charge carrying 1 to 5 years in the penitentiary for both parties. Virginia even nullified interracial marriages performed in other jurisdictions. If you got married in New York and moved to Virginia, your marriage was void. In Mississippi, the penalty ranged up to life imprisonment in earlier periods. Later, it was revised to a $500 fine and/or up to 10 years imprisonment. In Missouri in 1949, the penalty was 2 years in the penitentiary or minimum 3 months in county jail, plus a fine of minimum $100 or both. In Arkansas, the revised 1947 law stated that a third offense resulted in 1 to 3 years in prison. Third offense. That means they were tracking repeat. Violations. Eleanor and Frederick's marriage occurred 20 years before the Supreme Court's Loving v. Virginia decision in 1967 struck down all remaining anti-miscegenation laws nationwide. They were pioneers. But being pioneers meant enduring relentless discrimination and searching desperately for a place that would accept them. After their marriage, they initially lived in Boston. Frederick worked multiple jobs to support his family. Around 1948 to 1950, they decided to try living in Germany. Frederick's father owned a cement manufacturing business in Göttingen. Maybe, they thought, Germany would be more accepting. They were wrong. They faced severe discrimination in post-war Germany. Frederick's mother was openly hostile to Eleanor. The same racial prejudices that existed in America existed in Germany. They couldn't escape it, so they returned to the United States. They briefly lived in Morton, Pennsylvania. There, they encountered a school segregation incident that required intervention from the NAACP. Even in the North, even years after the war, their interracial family was not welcome. They kept searching. They kept moving. They kept hoping that somewhere in America there was a place that would accept them. And then they found it. Village Creek in South Norwalk, Connecticut. This community was intentionally integrated, founded in 1949 to 1950 as a prejudice-free zone. It was a planned community designed specifically for people like Eleanor and Frederick, people who didn't fit the racial boundaries of 1950s America. People who refused to accept segregation. People who wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood where their children could play with children of all races without judgment. In Village Creek, Eleanor and Frederick finally found peace. Frederick got a job at Pepperidge Farm in product development. Think about that journey for a moment. A former German POW captured in Italy, held in an Arizona prison camp, now working for one of America's most iconic brands, developing products that would end up on American dinner tables. That's the American story we don't usually tell. Frederick brought his skills, his work ethic, and his determination to succeed, despite every obstacle placed in his path. Eleanor worked as a registered nurse. After all her training, after serving her country in uniform, after facing discrimination at every turn, she continued to care for people. She didn't become bitter. She didn't give up on helping others. She continued the work she'd trained for at Fort Huachuca and performed at Camp Florence. They raised their 2 sons, Stephen, born December 1946, and Chris Albert, in a home filled with love, acceptance, and the knowledge that their very existence defied unjust laws. Their children grew up in Village Creek, attending integrated schools, playing with children of all races, experiencing the kind of normal childhood that would have been impossible in most of 1950s America. And they built a life together. Not an easy life, not a life without challenges, but a life together in a community that accepted them. Their son, Chris Albert, became a jazz trumpeter. He played with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, Count Basie Orchestra, Lionel Hampton, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He also worked as a recording engineer. Chris is the primary source for his parents' story. He grew up hearing about his parents' extraordinary romance. He grew up knowing that his very existence was the result of an act of defiance against racist laws in two countries. Eleanor and Frederick were married for over 50 years. Frederick died in 2001. Eleanor died in 2005. And here's what's remarkable about their story. It remained almost completely unknown for 70 years. The earliest documented public mention of their relationship appears in 2003 in Barbara Brooks Tomlin's book, G.I. Nightingales. One sentence about an extraordinary love story that defied laws, military regulations, and societal expectations on two continents. In 2010 to 2012, journalist Alexis Clark began researching this story after reading that one sentence in Tomlin's book. Clark is an adjunct professor at Columbia Journalism School and former editor at Town & Country. She spent years interviewing Chris Albert, conducting archival research, and piecing together documentation. On May 15, 2013, 8 years after Eleanor's death, 12 years after Frederick's death, Clark published the first detailed account in the New York Times. That article opened the floodgates. In May 2018, Clark published her book, Enemies in Love, through the New Press. The Smithsonian Magazine published a feature article. PBS NewsHour did a documentary segment. NPR's Code Switch did an extensive interview. The story spread through Wikipedia and multiple media outlets. Suddenly, this hidden history was everywhere. But here's what's important. This story is verified. Eleanor Powell is confirmed through U.S. Census records from 1940 and 1950, Social Security records, and military documentation. Frederick Albert is confirmed through census records and military documentation. Their marriage is documented. Their sons exist. Chris Albert is a verified jazz musician with an extensive career. Period photographs from 1944 to 1947 exist, credited to Chris Albert's family collection. The broader historical context is extensively documented in peer-reviewed academic literature. Dr. Matthias Rice, senior lecturer in history at the University of Exeter in England, is the leading academic authority on German POWs in the United States during World War II. His work has been published in the Journal of African American History and the Journal of Military History by University of Chicago Press. His research directly addresses racism in U.S. POW camps and forms the scholarly foundation for understanding Black-German POW interactions. Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America, published by Scarborough House in 1996, is called The Definitive History by the Seattle Times. Ron Robbins' The Barbed Wire College from Princeton University Press in 1995 is the standard academic reference. Matthew Delmont's Half American from 2022, written by the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College, is the top scholarship in African American World War II military history. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a special exhibit called Fighting for the Right to Fight: African American Experiences in WWII The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture has the Double Victory exhibition about the African American military experience. This is not fringe history. This is documented, verified, mainstream historical scholarship. And yet, the story of Eleanor and Frederick remained hidden for 70 years. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative. The good war narrative doesn't have room for American nurses being refused service while Nazi POWs dine freely. It doesn't have room for black soldiers watching German prisoners eat in dining halls they're banned from. It doesn't have room for the U.S. Army deliberately assigning black nurses to POW camps because they assumed racial prejudice would prevent romance. But here's what that racist assumption missed. Love doesn't care about your policies. Love doesn't care about your laws. Love doesn't care about your racial categories. Frederick Albert looked at Eleanor Powell and saw the woman he was going to marry. Eleanor looked at Frederick and saw a man worth risking everything for. And they built a life together that lasted over 50 years. They lived through Alabama's 2 to 7 year prison sentences for interracial marriage. They lived through Florida's 10-year prison terms. They lived through Mississippi's potential life imprisonment. They lived through Virginia declaring their marriage void. They lived through German discrimination and American segregation. They lived through moving from city to city, searching for acceptance, and they found it in Village Creek, Connecticut, a community built on the radical idea that people of different races could live together in peace. Their story reveals something uncomfortable about World War II. We like to think of it as the good war. We like to think America was purely fighting for freedom and democracy. But the reality is more complex. The reality is that 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States, and many of them experienced better treatment than black American soldiers. The reality is that black nurses who volunteered to serve wounded Americans were instead assigned to care for Nazi prisoners while being subjected to racial slurs and segregation. The reality is that the United States was fighting fascism abroad while enforcing Jim Crow at home. Eleanor and Frederick's love story happened in the middle of that contradiction. And their 50-year marriage stands as proof that the racist assumptions underlying American policy were wrong. The Army assumed black nurses and white POWs would have no attraction. They were wrong. Society assumed interracial relationships were unnatural and doomed to fail. They were wrong. Laws assumed racial categories were fixed and absolute. They were wrong. Let's recap what you now know. You know that black nurses in World War II were restricted to 2 types of assignments: segregated military bases and POW camps. You know that 48 black nurses were deliberately assigned to Camp Florence to replace white nurses because the Army assumed racial prejudice would prevent fraternization. You know that Eleanor Powell and Frederick Albert defied that assumption and developed a secret relationship at extraordinary risk. You know they deliberately conceived a child before Frederick's deportation as a strategy to enable his return. You know they married in New York City on June 26, 1947, because it was one of only 9 states where their marriage was legal. You know that 30 of 48 states prohibited interracial marriage with penalties including years in prison. You know they spent years searching for acceptance, finally finding it in Village Creek, Connecticut. And you know they were married over 50 years until Frederick's death in 2001 and Eleanor's death in 2005. You started this video knowing World War II as the good war. You now know it was also the war where German POWs received better treatment than black American soldiers. You now understand the bitter irony of fighting fascism abroad while enforcing racial fascism at home. And you now have proof that love can defy laws, regulations, borders, and deeply entrenched racism. Here's what I want you to do. Think about the assumptions you make. Think about the policies that seem reasonable until you look at the human cost. Think about the stories that remain hidden because they don't fit the comfortable narrative. Eleanor and Frederick's story was hidden for 70 years. How many other stories are still hidden? If this changed how you see history, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. Drop a comment with one thing that surprised you most about this story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And check the description for links to Alexis Clark's book, Enemies in Love, the Smithsonian Magazine article, and the PBS NewsHour documentary. In my next video, I'm revealing another hidden World War II story that completely contradicts what you learned in school. It involves a secret program, thousands of women, and a cover-up that lasted decades. You won't believe what the U.S. government kept classified until the 1990s. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring about the stories that matter. I'll see you in the next one.